Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Anna Pellegatta, and I work at the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensic Research Lab. Today's event is the first of a series of events called 360 Virtual that the DFR Lab is organizing to discuss what experts call the infodemic around COVID-19 in different regions around the world. Today, we host these events in collaboration with our partners at Friends of Europe and Debating Europe. And we invited three speakers to join us today to discuss the infodemic targeting Western Europe and in particular Italy, Spain, and France. So joining us today are Lia Quartapelle, member of the Italian Parliament, Nicolas De Pedro, senior fellow at the Institute for Statecraft, and Antoine Bondaz, a fellow at the Foundation for Strategic Research. So just quickly before we start, I reminder that if you're joining this session live on Zoom, you can submit your questions throughout the event using the Q&A box below, and we will try to address as many questions as possible after speakers' remarks. So to quickly introduce the topic, at the DFR Lab, we're set to identify, expose, and above all, explain disinformation and hostile manipulation of information using open source data. Since the COVID-19 outbreak, of course, we started monitoring the information environment in different countries around the world, with particular attention to news, stories, and narratives regarding the virus. As I'm sure you all experienced firsthand, the information environment everywhere has been overwhelmed with the stories and narratives about the virus, starting from its origins, potential cures, conspiracy theories, including stories about governments creating the virus in laboratories, and all sort of news and criticism about governments' responses to try to contain the spread of the virus in their countries. Among all these stories are the ones spread by domestic and foreign actors to achieve political gains. So either domestic political parties or political actors or other communities spreading divisive narratives to gain voter support, or countries like Russia and China spreading disinformation and propaganda to try to gain more influence in Europe. Italy, Spain, and France are three of the countries in Western Europe that have been suffering the most from the spread of the virus, but also that have been targeted the most by the infodemic, to include propaganda from China and Russia. So I will now pass the word to our speakers, who will provide a perspective from each one of the countries, Italy, Spain, and France. And in particular, I would ask them to focus on what you're seeing in terms of information chaos in your countries and what narratives around COVID-19 are prevailing in your country. Why you think disinformation is dangerous, especially at a time of crisis like the one that we're living right now. And lastly, the COVID-19 crisis seems to have exacerbated vulnerabilities and internal division within the European Union. Among other factors, also because of narratives spread by either domestic populist parties or actors and countries like Russia and China. So how influential do you think the information operations from Russia and China have been in this sense? Do you think that they had an actual impact on the domestic political debate in your country? Or do you think that, for example, anti-EU, anti-NATO, anti-US sentiments in your countries is mostly built on domestic political and social factors? So I will now pass the word to Lia first. So Lia, if you want to start, I remind you 5-6 minutes. Go ahead.
Well, thank you, Anna, and thank you to the Atlantic Council, to Friends of Europe for this very interesting occasion to compare and talk about an issue that we underestimated. I will speak about Italy, outlining briefly what the context was and why the misinformation campaign was particularly successful in Italy. We were, as everybody knows, the first country hit by the virus. And so the country was not prepared, but Europe was not prepared. In the first days, we let a good terrain for propaganda and misinformation from abroad, because the country was not prepared physically. We didn't have especially face masks. And at the same time, our European countries approved laws to nationalize national assets of especially DPIs. So we didn't have face masks, and face masks bought from Italian importers were stopped in Germany and in France. Of course, this was exploited by China, which sent graciously a plane with 200,000 face masks donated by the Chinese government and a few doctors from China. So the contrast was stark, and this was a fact. We had masks blocked in France and Germany, bought with Italian money, and free masks coming from China. In a country that woke up one day with a pandemic, the contrast was clear, and it was amplified by national TV. I mean, this was news, was true news. So this was the context. What happened in terms of misinformation? Various things. There is a parliamentary inquiry going on at our Committee on Oversight over Secret Service. And mainly what they found out, what they're discussing, is a different kind of misinformation. First of all, misinformation by state actors. Probably the most starking example is a tweet relaunched by the spokesperson for the Chinese Minister of Foreign Affairs, which pictured a video which was called Grazie Cina, Thank You China, which was manipulated. It showed Chinese flags that were not there. It showed Italian people thanking Chinese people, but they were not there. I mean, they were thanking, but doctors and Italian nurses. So this was the first thing, state actors spreading misinformation. Secondly, we saw new accounts magnifying a certain narrative against Europe and against what our government, the measures that our government was taken. Then we saw fake news on health issues, vaccines, use of medicines, and on government measures. And then foreign sources amplifying information about disorders, about disunity of the Italian people. Of course, we had a bit of fraction, but we never had so far disorder in the street, while Sputnik and the like magnified false information. What were the objectives of this misinformation campaign? First of all, to discredit government action. Secondly, to create or magnify social tensions. Thirdly, to discredit official media in favor of non-official, root-based sources of information. What was the result of this campaign? We had a poll in the past week showing that in Italy, 52% of those polled say that China is a friendly country, and only 32% say that the US is a friendly country. And 45% of the Italian people say that Germany is an enemy country, and 38% say that France is an enemy country. In the same polls, 36% of the Italian people that were surveyed say that they want stronger future relationship with China, compared to 30% that want stronger future relationship with the US. So, I mean, the misinformation campaign, coupled with unpreparedness from the European side on this propaganda war actually worked. Two things to close. I think there is a lot of material here for our parliamentary inquiry on how foreign interferences are shifting the direction of our foreign policy. And I think there is a lot of material for reflection on how prepared we are as Europeans to counter this kind of campaigns. The beginning of the virus was a disaster in terms also of countering misinformation campaign coming from different state actors. The European Union was completely unprepared, and I mean, we left a lot of ground to those that exploited it successfully.
Thank you, Leah, very much. Now passing the word to Nico for his remarks.
Hi, hello everyone. So, I very much agree and enjoy what Leah has said, and well, three quick points. First one, connecting to her last point, is that as with the virus, we were not ready to deal on proper time, neither with the pandemic nor with the disinformation or with the required strategic communications to deal with it. And this has been the first big problem, I would say.
I lost the audio. I don't know if it's a problem on your end.
I can hear you.
Oh, okay. Now we can hear you. Yes. Okay. Can you please repeat the last thing you said?
Yeah, sure. I was saying that as with the virus, we were not ready to deal on proper time with the pandemic, neither with the infodemic. So to deal with this in a proper way. I think so far the most affected institution in terms of the social perception about it has been the EU, as Leah said. So in Spain, it's exactly the same. Spain is or has been traditionally a very pro-Europeanist country, to some extent actually a bit naive in its pro-Europeanist views. And now this view is very much affected by how the EU is perceived to not to have reacted properly to deal with this. This is the first problem. So we are definitely not ready to deal with the disinformation or the new challenges and threats related to the digital media ecosystem. Our states are not ready for that. Our societies are definitely not ready. Second point, well, the main source of disinformation or the main problems so far have been mostly local. So it's very much a domestic thing in Spain. Unfortunately, now the political environment in the country is highly polarized. And situation is not nice, and it's getting worse in terms of the local politics. And this is very bad in terms of dealing with the pandemic, and afterwards also with the impact, political, economic impact that this pandemic will have. The main source initially, the main source of disinformation in Spain was mostly some parts and sections of the Catalan nationalists promoting different narratives, blaming Madrid for the spread. Madrid is where the central government of Spain is located. So spreading the idea that the central government was somehow responsible for the virus and its spread across the country and specifically in Catalonia. This has been also very nasty, I would say. And third point, and specifically related to China and Russia, well, I think in a lower scale, we had a similar situation as Leah was describing for Italy, but less visible maybe, but they're very similar. So with the Chinese, I would say that it was interesting that they were mostly trying to shape the narrative, and from this perspective to achieve information supremacy, or definitely a good view, or a good, to frame and to put China into a good, nice view. And I think also but we need to approach this from a wider perspective. That's one of the problems also when we approach this just as from the disinformation perspective. The different small events have been very helpful in terms of trying to promote this positive narrative about Chinese reaction and Chinese help or support for Spain. The debate about the Chinese responsibility in the origin and spread of the virus is already here, but it's still a bit marginal, so it's not very much there on the public discussion. But I'm sure that the moment that the pandemic is under control or the situation is under control from a sanitary perspective, I'm sure that this debate will raise more attention and will be very much central in our domestic discussions. And related to Russia, and I will finish with this, I think there is a sort of inertia since December and definitely since January. The Russian state media were promoting different, mostly conspiracy theories about the narrative, and it's not exactly about spreading lies or false information. It's mostly about biased narratives and insidious sometimes narratives. And I will finish with this. You have to take into account that RT in Spanish is very different from RT in English. So it's less disruptive, and it has more the will to become a mainstream media, but in Latin America, no, not in Spain. Spain is somehow marginal, but in Latin America, it's becoming very influential. From Mexico to Argentina, with different degrees depending on the country, of course. But that's a very relevant factor on how they approach. And in Latin America, they have a very much left-wing approach, let's say. Very much anti-US, anti-Western in general, and trying to support left-wing governments from Latin America. Venezuelan case, Bolivarian is the most obvious case, but another ones, right? And yeah, we can trace some of, clear connection to many of these conspiracy theories that are already circulating in Spain to the constellation of media that are around the Kremlin, which is not necessarily RT or Sputnik, although Sputnik is much more aggressive than RT generally in Spanish, I mean. Not necessarily the news, but definitely the op editorials. So that's how they spread these kind of conspiracies normally. And for now, I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Nico, very much. And again, the same question goes to Antoine.
Yeah, so hi everyone, thank you a lot, Anna. Thanks to Atlantic Council and Friends of Europe for organizing such interesting events. I'll be very complimentary to what Leah and Nico said before. Just as a reminder, France has been used to disinformation, of course, from foreign countries for years. Our minister, Jean-Yves Le Drian, made a key speech on April 2018. And a law, actually, again, the manipulation of information was adopted at the National Assembly in November 2018. So it's not something new, but it used to be mostly focusing on election campaign interference and on Russia. Yet, foreign countries' disinformation and influence operations are much more diverse, often disconnected from election periods, and also coming from China. And there is actually in France a huge bias in terms of disinformation, since much media coverage and academic publications are focusing on Russia. Yet, of course, China is a growing issue. And as our Japanese friends used to say, they used to tell us that they see the head of the dragon while we see only the head of the bear. More and more in France, we see the head of both the bear and the Chinese dragon. What is sure is that during the COVID-19 outbreak, France has been very exposed to disinformation, not only from internal sources, domestic sources, of course, and Nico mentioned the example in Spain, but also from foreign countries. And what is very specific in France is that most of this information coming from China actually came from the Chinese embassy in Paris. They published a very, very offensive statement a little bit more than a week ago on April the 12th. And that statement basically was a disgrace. And it led actually to the ambassador being summoned by the Minister of Foreign Affairs, something that is unprecedented. because he was not summoned because of French-China relations, but because of something that one of his diplomats said openly on the Chinese embassy website. That statement was clearly a disgrace because rumors, disinformation, and even insults, everything was in it. Elected officials, journalists, experts, everyone was being attacked. I will give you just 5 very, very short examples of such disinformations. The first 2 are more general, and the last 3 are really, really linked to that infamous statement. The first one, and Leah mentioned it, is linked actually to the origins of the virus, with both Zhao Lijian, the spokesperson of the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, hinting that it could come from China, from the US, etc. Something that has been actually repeated also by Chinese diplomats in France. The second one is the Chinese embassy trying to attack journalists for labeling the SARS-CoV-2 or the COVID-19 as so-called Wuhan virus or China virus. Let us not forget that these terms were actually used by the Chinese media, including Wuhan pneumonia, by the end of January, before an official name was given. And the main objective, of course, was to discredit French media and to label them as anti-China, something that has been repeated plenty of time ever since. The 3 other examples are much more actually offensive. The first one is that the crisis management in France was criticized openly by the embassy, and they said, I quote, "Nursing home caregivers abandoned their positions overnight. They deserted collectively, leaving their residents to die of starvation and illness." This is, of course, completely fake. This is open disinformation. And this is actually even insulting to all the health personnel in France. The second one is that they wrote that American and European politicians said at the beginning of the epidemic that, I quote, "the virus would only hit yellow people." This is what was written in the statements. Once again, no one ever say that in France. I'm not even sure someone say that as a social network in the US or in Europe. But of course, this is open disinformation. The idea was to label French politicians as racist. The fifth one is actually in the same lines. The statements mentioned that the Taiwanese authorities, supported by more than 80 French MPs, used the word nigger, I quote, to attack the DG of the WHO. Once again, this is wrong for at least 2 reasons. First, no Taiwanese authorities ever insulted the DG using especially that very, very offensive word. And second, the statement implies that French MPs would support this kind of racist comment and behavior. This is, of course, openly and open disinformation. So the objectives seems to be quite clear from the Chinese embassy in Paris. The first one is to discredit any voices criticizing Chinese authorities, and the strategy they have is to basically overgeneralize isolated statements or isolated events that do not represent in any way the legitimate questions we may have in China and abroad. The second one seems to be to reinforce nationalist sentiments by portraying China as a victim under the pretext that criticism of the regime is or would be a Western plot to destabilize the country. The third one, and that's something that is also very, very important for Europe, is to present the regime, the Chinese regime, as exemplary and even superior to Western democracies. And that's something that has been a lot in the Chinese media, shifting the blame, of course, to local authorities in Wuhan, but also abroad, and minimizing their own responsibility. The fourth one is to intimidate journalists and experts. Most of them in France have so far been labeled as anti-China. And the fifth one is more general, but it's very, very important to put it back into context, is that the Chinese authorities clearly want to increase China's so-called discursive power and to better tell China's story and make China's voice heard abroad. These 2 expressions, better tell China's story and make China's voice heard, are very, very important because they come actually from a key speech from the Secretary General Xi Jinping that he pronounced in October 2013 on a key speech on external propaganda. So this kind of Chinese information in France and in Europe is for us unprecedented, and clearly we need actually to react. all the more since influence campaigns goes far more just that this kind of information manipulation. And while the responsibility of some democracies in crisis management is obvious, particularly in terms of lack of preparedness and sometimes inadequate crisis management system, and we all agree on that, is that does not mean, of course, that the Chinese management has been perfect, that we should not have any questions to the Chinese government, and that democracies would not be able to manage this kind of crisis. We saw that in Germany, in South Korea, or even in Taiwan, that these democracies handle actually the epidemic quite well. So clearly there is extreme missteps and declaration from some diplomats, as in France, and that's actually a good opportunity, because these comments are so extreme, so offensive, that they lead to a popular and to a political backlash. And that's actually the opportunity to identify, expose, and even argue against this form of disinformation. So even though it's clearly a threat, it's also, I would say, an opportunity for the larger public and audience to be aware of what's going on, for the political class to mobilize, and for Chinese information, because this is what I focus on, to be exposed and to be not only exposed, but also counter-argued.
Thank you very much. That's very interesting. As DFR Lab, I personally conducted some research on the Italian case, and some of the narratives and even the sources of, especially, of course, Russian and but also Chinese propaganda are very, very similar to France. So, for example, the Chinese embassy in Rome spreading propaganda on social media. So, thank you very much for these remarks. I now have one question a little bit more specific for each speaker, and I would ask you to stay within like a couple minutes so we can then move to the audience Q&A. So the first question that I have is for Nico. And so while Russia's information operations in Europe are renowned and have been monitored for decades, this crisis has really brought the attention to the penetration of Chinese propaganda machine in Europe. So when it comes to information operations, what are the differences, if any, between Russia and China's tactics in Europe? And which one do you believe is more dangerous? And someone from the audience also asked whether or not you believe that China and Russia cooperate and coordinate on spreading some of the same narratives or some of the same stories.
And that in 2 minutes? Wow. Okay, I will try. Well, I start with the final, with the second question. So, do they cooperate? I don't think so, but do they learn from each other? Definitely. And yes, they converge, and there is a strategic cooperation. So, in the broader picture, if we go to the broader picture, yes, because there are shared strategic goals by Russia and China, which is to undermine the West and to end with to put an end to the Western U.S.-led hegemony. That's a clear shared goal between Russia and China, and so from that perspective, yes. But I'm not sure. I mean, we do need more research or more evidence to say that they cooperate at the tactical level in different operations. But so far, the narratives go together because. Is about how bad are the Western powers handling these, how unfair are Western societies, so to exploit our vulnerabilities. I think Leah already mentioned that in her presentation. So what is interesting, and as I said, it is not yet, I mean, this debate is not yet taken off in Spain because we are so much focused on dealing with a sanitary crisis, which is tough in Spain, as you know. But for instance, when the virus was not yet here or was arriving, but was not yet considered as a pandemic, putting the society on the verge of a pretty serious situation, there were a number of let's say, photo operations or something. Like there were many videos circulating on social media of anonymous citizens of Chinese origin living here in Spain, donating face masks to our police or sanitary personnel who were complaining publicly of lacking these items. So there were doubts. Yeah, are they just anonymous citizens that they feel that they want to contribute, or this is something that is mastermind or somehow organized by someone, meaning the embassy or something? Yeah, and I think this is a pending question. Yeah, and it's an important one in terms of influence operations, because so far, well, we just have few surveys, so we need more research and more data to make or to raise strong conclusions. But the first surveys that we have is made by one Spanish think tank in Madrid, Elcano Royal Institute, said that the image about China has improved over this month. So it seems that this kind of a strategy or approach is paying off. But as I said, we need more data to raise more conclusions. But it was, well, definitely very interesting. This is the Italian case, but I would like to make two quick points, which I think are important for the Western community at large. Both Leah and Antoine were mentioning how Chinese diplomats are using social media or addressing our media and using Twitter. And this is very interesting and it's very telling, because Twitter is forbidden in China. So there is no symmetry, right? So our policymakers, our leaders cannot address directly the Chinese people. They have to go to Chinese citizens. So they have to go through media under control and surveillance of the Chinese authorities. I think this is an important point. Second one is about, I was very shocked by the by how, I mean, how deployment of these doctors in Italy developed. Yeah, particularly when they gave a press conference and they were criticizing very much and very harshly the Italian authorities. Maybe they were right in their points. So that's not my point. But it was very amazing. I cannot imagine an equivalent situation in which a group of European doctors, Italians, Spanish, French, or combination of EU mission going into China and openly and too much criticizing the Chinese authorities in front of the media, speaking publicly, even privately. I would be surprised, but more so in the public. So this is, I think, a lesson that we need to learn. And a second point, or third point, sorry, I'm lost now with my point. So the last point is about the upcoming months, because now we are dealing, at least in the south of Europe, with a sanitary crisis. But now it's coming the political, economic impact of this crisis, I think also in the US and in other parts of the world. So our vulnerabilities will be much more clear, and that can be exploited. And China and Russia will be also affected by this crisis, but this could be also an incentive to move, I mean, to go forward, yeah, to try to exploit it more. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This actually opens up perfectly to the next question that I have for Antoine. So building on what has already been discussed, what impact do you think that Russian and Chinese influence operation will have on shaping the equilibrium post-crisis? So to explain this to someone that is not an expert in this field, what is the worst risk of having a stronger presence of Russia and China in Europe rather than the traditional alliance asset that we have right now?
I think the first impact will be in terms of public opinion and public perception on China, on Russia, on the US, and on the EU. I think Leah mentioned it a little bit before. That's very, very important, because a lot of Eurosceptic political parties and people will be actually fed with this kind of Chinese and Russian narrative. And that's a threat actually in terms of political unity in Europe, but also in some key countries, including in Southern Europe, from Spain to Italy, but also in France. The second one is that the crisis, as Nico mentioned, is not only a sanitary crisis, it's of course an economic crisis, and it's going to become de facto a political crisis. And in time of economic vulnerabilities, including for key companies, it would be easier for some countries with huge financial capacities to acquire basically key companies. I'm not thinking about Russia, but mostly thinking about China. We saw that a few days ago, the CITIC, the Chinese sovereign funds, acquired actually, or became a majority stakeholder in a major media group in Czech Republic. And that's something that could have key consequences in terms of press freedom in some key Eastern European countries, but once again, more globally on the economic and on the companies in Europe. On the political aspects, I'm not sure the key objective of China is to make sure that there is, I would say, a breakup within Europe. I think what they want for sure is to transform the nation they've made and the economic partnership they have signed, etc., into further influence within the EU to make sure that EU is not united on key issues while dealing on China. We saw it with Greece, we saw it with Hungary before, etc., be it on the South China Sea, on the Xinjiang issue, etc. One of the key objectives of Beijing is to avoid the EU to find, I would say, to find cohesion and to find a consensus on some key issues that would be critical to China. The third one that is also very, very important, and I don't know whether that crisis is an opportunity or a threat so far, is whether there will be a collective think or a collective debate in Europe on what we should do next. I know that the French president has been pushing a lot on the idea of European sovereignty. It has been labeled most of the time anti-US, etc. I think that's not the case. That's not what the president is pushing. The idea is actually to be more autonomous, more independent, more sovereign in terms of strategic sectors, be it on defense, but also be it on sanitary issues, on agricultural issues, and not to be too exposed to dependence from abroad and to abroad, like with the case in terms of mask, in terms of medicine, etc. from China. And I think we need to have this collective debate in Europe to make sure that we do not put into question globalization. That's not the point. It's not the EU that's going to go against free trade, etc. But the key question is whether on some key strategic sectors, and the key strategic is maybe much more wide than just the military sectors, we should be less dependent. It means to diversify more our export and import partners, and it also means maybe to relocate some parts of the production back in Europe, not back in single countries, but at least back in Europe, with once again a key objective to reduce the exposure of risky dependency towards key countries, including China.
Thank you very much. And the last question goes to Leah before opening up to the audience Q&A. So the Italian government has recently appointed a task force to debunk fake news about COVID-19, which I believe is a first but pretty important step, at least to address the threats posed by disinformation. So what is your take on this initiative, and what other measures do you believe governments should take to counter disinformation, especially when it comes to designed influence operations pushed by state actors? So for example, it's true that the task force is a great initiative, but Russia also sent military personnel in Northern Europe. So what measures can be put in place to counter disinformation and influence operations comprehensively?
Well, I think that the first measure, which is not a measure, but it's more a way of behaving, comes from the communication that we do as government and as politicians. The fact that strategically we didn't think about how to thank for helps received was a problem, because if you don't think, I mean, we were grateful, but for example, we didn't think, well, I mean, we let the Chinese plane land and we let them have the press conference that we discussed before, but we didn't organize the same thing when 1 million masks donated from Germany came into Italy. And I mean, if you don't think strategically, to what extent symbols are important for a country that is confused, afraid, saddened by the crisis. It is difficult then to put in place a task force and so on. So I would say we need to be very careful with institutional communication. We need to be very much aware of the power of symbols and use them. And I say this at the Italian level, but also at the European level. I agree with that very much with what Antoine was saying. The fact that we didn't have face masks with the EU flag stamped on it means a lot. It means that we don't have the symbol of European unity to show to the people. And we were not, all of us were not prepared. I mean, the European Central Bank is doing a lot, European institutions are doing a lot. We hope that European governments will follow. But the fact that strategically the communication was not there, and that maybe certain parties in government and outside government were playing on this lack of strategy, really then meant the results of the poll that I said earlier.
Thank you very much. Also, I saw that a lot of participants asked for that poll, so we will find the way after the live to share it. Thank you very much. So I will now hand it over to Viola Bianchetti from Debating Europe. They crowdsourced 2 questions from the Citizen platform that they run. So Viola, after you.
Thank you, Anna. You hear me correctly, right? Okay, great. Yes, thank you a lot for the introduction. As you already mentioned, Debating Europe is a project of Friends of Europe and is a citizens engagement platform. So it's the aim of our project, of our platform, is to connect citizens with policymakers and experts. We have a community of 5 million users throughout all of Europe, and especially in the younger, let's say, age range between 18 and 35 years old. And our purpose is really to bridge the gap between these young Europeans and experts and policymakers. And we are really thankful to be here today in cooperation with the Atlantic Council, because in the past few weeks we ran several debates on COVID-19 and especially how it is affecting the everyday life of Europeans and how different people are experiencing this unprecedented situation. And indeed, the topic of fake news and disinformation was coming up very often in the comments and the questions of our users. Therefore, we are really happy to be here today and be able to put 2 of these questions to you. Since I think we are a tiny bit tight on time, I will address the first question to Nico De Pedro. The question is from one of our users named Zold, who thinks that all nations, including European states and the US, use propaganda to help shape the narrative that is more beneficial for them. But how do we draw a line between traditional or acceptable propaganda and hostile information operations?
Well, I think it's very different, the Western approach to that of Russia and China. So I think have little to do with each other. How they use information, as how they weaponize information. We have nothing like that in the Western world. I mean, it's a very specific domain, if you want, of the intelligence services, but it's pretty much limited to wartime when it comes to the armed forces. And there is not this aggressive use of the information, so it's not considered as a weapon. What we have is very transparent and ineffective to some extent, so it's very much about public diplomacy. And here, and that's a problem, and also we have the limitations of our governments. We have democratic governments that cannot restrict freedom of speech, the free flow of information, etc., etc. So there are strict limitations, and it's good that we have these limitations. What we need to address, or what we need to find a way to tackle with it, is how to prevent this foreign malign influence from taking place, how to prevent this from happening. And so far we don't have an answer. But what is clear that we are not ready to deal with it. Because the point is that when we address, and it's pretty clear to me when it comes to Russia, and I think it's very similar, but I think it needs deserves more research when it comes to China, is that this is a part of a wider approach. So it's not only about disinformation, or it's not only about the use of information. So it's a wider approach, and how they deal or they use different tools as a weapons that includes politics, corruption, economics, many issues, in order to undermine our countries from within. And in order to prevent this from happening, we first need to have a better understanding and a shared understanding about our political establishment. And we are far from it. Maybe there is going to be a reaction in front of the current crisis. But, and I finish with this. Now we will realize that it was obvious for those dealing with this issue, but a small community dealing with this issue, that we lack completely a deterrence capability in front of foreign malign influence and disinformation. So we need to develop that capacity, but there's not an obvious way to develop. So that's what we need to keep working, basically. Thanks.
Thank you for your answer. The second question is for Lia Quartapelle, and is from our user Antonio, who thinks that over the long term, media literacy is the only way to fight back against online propaganda. And so we wanted to ask you, what do you think about it, and how can we improve media literacy as a, let's say, long-term tool to fight disinformation?
Well, I think that a few measures were taken already by social media platform, and I think we should work with them much more in order for them to show what is news coming from from a reputed sources, and what is a blog, what is an opinion, what is something different. Secondly, and we always say this, but we should work a lot with kids to encourage their critical thinking. I think that, we're speaking about a virus, we're not speaking about the many changes that will introduce into our lives. One of the main changes, at least in Italy, is that a lot of education has been digital, online. It is a good time to use this opportunity also to do a bit of media and social media literacy with the kids that are a lot more online than they used to be. So it could be something that we put also in the thinking that we're doing for the second phase. These are two ideas. I'm not an expert on media literacy, but this is what I think can be done.
Thank you for your answer. Yes, back to Anna, I guess.
Thank you very much, Viola. I will now, moving on, I'd like to give the word to Jamie Shia, Senior Fellow at Friends of Europe, for a quick question or two to our speakers. Jamie?
Anna, thanks very much. And my thanks, of course, to you, to the Atlantic Council, to Digital Forensics Lab, and the three really excellent speakers for a very lively session today, which I followed with enormous interest. I think the first thing, and Leah rightly pointed this out, is that the European Union, NATO, have been doing a lot to provide assistance to all of their member states, particularly France, Spain, and Italy. My old organization, NATO, has been lifting in thousands of tons of supplies, of field hospitals, and organising an airlift. And Leah pointed out to the things that the neighbouring states and the EU has been doing. So why are we so unsuccessful when we're doing so much at getting these stories across? Why are we being out-communicated by countries that are deploying some very symbolic donations, like a couple of Russian troops at Bergamo or a couple of tons of Chinese face masks? So that would be my first question. Why are we so bad at getting this this positive side of the story across. My second comment relates to the later stages of the COVID-19 crisis, because, of course, over the last couple of weeks, we've seen governments start mobilizing. My own country, the UK, has its daily press briefings. We're listening a lot more to scientists and the experts than we used to. I remember during the Brexit referendum campaign back in 2016, a British minister, Michael Gove, said, "We've had enough of experts." In other words, we're happy to go with passions. But I think one of the good things about the coronavirus is that experts and scientists are once again back on the front line. And is that also an antidote to fake news and disinformation? So my next question is, as governments mobilize their briefings and their public information campaigns, as people turn more to the traditional media, as they usually do in a crisis, to get reliable information, as we show unprecedented social solidarity in the lockdown, in coming together and helping each other, and become more cohesive, hopefully, societies, hopefully for the long run, post-crisis as well, are we therefore seeing a kind of antibody to this new form of infection developing in our own communities? And therefore, what I'd like to ask the panel is that once the crisis is over and we all turn to the lessons learned and to the theme of resilience, what lessons would you want governments to sort of digest and to put in their media DNA so that we are much better able to handle the next big shock or pandemic, which will certainly come? And then finally, and forgive me for being so greedy with the questions, but it's been such a brilliant session. One implication of this crisis is that we're spending a lot more of our time staring at screens, as I'm doing at the moment, spending our lives online. The use of the internet has grown massively, the influence of the social media, and presumably after the crisis, we won't quite go back to living as we used to do in the physical world. Working from home might become the new normal. And therefore, if we're going to be much more dependent upon the virtual online universe for our understanding of reality in the future, are there implications for the social media companies? I mean, their platforms like Twitter and Facebook have not been mentioned yet, but before the crisis, as the experts know, a big issue was the responsibility of the social media companies in trying themselves to screen out the fake news and the disinformation, even if it can't be entirely perfect. And therefore, as part of the lessons learned package, is there a need for the social media platforms to do even more in this area? But again, many thanks indeed. Been a great debate. I wish we could have an extra hour. Thank you.
Maybe next time with an extra hour. But thank you, Jay, very much for these questions. I don't know who from the speakers wants to start addressing one or all of the questions from Jamie. Is there anyone? Antoine, do you want to start? You're muted.
Oh, okay, I can start. I mean, hello? It's
Nico.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Jamie, for your excellent points. Always very thought-provoking. So I don't have good answers to all your points. I share your concern about how invisible NATO support and the EU support and help is in or has been in our media and for our society at large. So it's very much unknown that these NATO supplies have arrived to Spain, to many, I mean, in Spain. So you need to look for the information. So it's not that obvious that is there, and that's definitely a problem. So we need to learn that lesson, that our communications are not working as well as it should be. I mean, it's not that effective. So that's a problem. I think for the EU and maybe to lesser extent to NATO, but also our institutions and including our national governments are still suffering from the crisis of legitimacy after the global financial crisis of 2008. So there is a ground there for those who are very skeptical or critical about our governments and institutions, etc. And it's much easier to blame those who your national governments, regional governments, or the EU and NATO than foreign strategic competitors that are far abroad. And third point related to this is how effective have been the Chinese immediately saying that any debate or questions about the origin of the virus in Wuhan, China, would be some sort of racism. because no one in general, majority of people don't want to be linked or associated or feeling that they are racist. Yeah, so they have been very smart in framing the issue in that way. And there we can say that maybe the concerns expressed by the Trump administration and President Trump were right, but the way it was framed was not the most smartest way, because easily was twisted by the Chinese saying that, oh, this is racism. Yeah, and it's not about that. It's about legitimate questioning about the origin of the virus in China and how the Chinese authorities handle the issue in the first steps. And I'm not sure that we will learn so many lessons. Hopefully, yes. But I don't want to sound very pessimistic, but you say once the crisis is over, let's see when the crisis is over, because it's not that we need a vaccine, is how to handle the economic and political impact that will be much more obvious once we are out. And just to end with a comment related to this new normal that you mentioned, Jamie, I think for sure it's going to be much more difficult to convince donors to fund seminars. Yeah, they would say just do it online. Yeah, so we are not paying for the for the flights. Thank you.
Alas.
Thank you very much, Nico. Antoine, do you want to go next?
Yeah, very, very briefly, in terms of communication, China versus NATO, etc. I think what was very efficient in the Chinese communication was twofold. First, it was the very first time that China was coming to our help. And that's actually a game changer of communication, because this is something unprecedented, unlike NATO often actually contributing and helping some European member states. Also, many local elected officials, etc., were willing actually to communicate a lot about China helping, because they were hoping for even more donation. But just to put them into perspective, and this is something very, very important that is not often done in the media, the Chinese authority offered 1 million masks to France. France is importing 2 billion masks from China. So it's 1 to 2,000. So these donations are, of course, welcome. They are useful, but of course, they do not, they are far from enough from covering our needs. In terms of communication, very briefly, and the fact that many scientists, I would say, are back in the game in terms of communication, I think this is very, very important. And another very, very important point is transparency. In democratic regime, we need transparency, because this is the only way to have the trust of the people and then to mobilize people. And the South Korean example on that issue and transparency is a perfect example that if you are transparent, then people trust you, people follow the advices, and you can fight effectively against the pandemic. Very briefly, in terms of preparation, what we can learn from this pandemic. First one, we need to get better preparation at the national level, but also at the EU level. I think the key question of having a crisis management mechanism that is much more wide at the EU level is one question. Another issue is to have stocks, strategic stocks at the EU level of some strategic goods, something that was lacking actually, and that would have been very, very useful in the very first days and weeks of the crisis, especially for Italy, but also for France and Spain. And the very last one on disinformation, I think we can learn a lot from the Taiwanese experience. The Taiwanese are very, very clear in the way they fight disinformation from China and other countries, but especially from China. They say one thing: you need to react fast. If you do not react to disinformation in 20 minutes to 1 hour, then disinformation spreads. So we need to be maybe much more reactive in the way governments, but also social platforms, individuals, think tanks fight against disinformation. And you don't have time actually to write a report and wait for 2 weeks to expose disinformation. You need to do it right away, once it's posted on YouTube, once it's posted on Twitter or on Facebook.
Thank you very much. We only have a couple of minutes left. So Leah, if you want to add something, please feel free.
I want to add two things, one per minute. First of all, to respond to Jamie, what are we not getting right? I think we are not thinking about our communication between allies as an instrument. I mean, our alliances are consolidated, but we tend to think that on the other side, welcome is granted and help is granted and thank is granted. This is not so. And we need to have, as Antoine was saying, as Nico was saying, we need to be prepared at least to say what we're doing, not to do propaganda, but at least to communicate transparently and openly what we're doing. Second, to an answer to all the questions on Russia. Of course, in Italy we had 100 personnel from Russia, but I didn't insist on this for two reasons. One, the Russian always overdo it, so they overdid it, and I mean their help is needed. We're thankful for that. But the way they presented it, I think in the end backfired to an extent. Secondly, what we saw in this crisis, and it came up before, is that we underestimated the Chinese way of dealing and of doing propaganda. Nico was saying it very clearly before. They don't use Twitter in China, but they use it against us. They don't let people criticize the government in China, but they do it against us. They use bots. They have like a technological capacity that we underestimated, and it became clear in this crisis. This is why I concentrated much more on China, because the Chinese way of doing things, in order for us to forget that they spread the virus, in order for us to be the weakest link in an attempt to be the hegemony power after the virus, is there, and we shouldn't underestimate it, and it's something new compared to the Russia propaganda.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I think that we're just running out of time, so I will close the panel right here. Thank you very much for all the speakers for joining us, for Jamie, Viola, Friends of Europe for co-hosting this event with us. I hope most of the questions from the audience were addressed throughout the speakers' remarks. Otherwise, we hope to continue the conversation offline and after these events as well. So thank you very much all. Have a good rest of your quarantine.
Thank you very much.
Healthy.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.